Hello. This video is going to talk about the sequence of other empires and civilizations which controlled Mesopotamia in the wake of the Sumerians. As you remember in chapter 2.1, we said the Sumerians were the first civilization to run things in Mesopotamia, but there were many others that came to be after them. And so this is going to be a lot of different names of different people. But I'm going to try to summarize each of them with sort of their most important accomplishment. Now, you may say, why did so many different civilizations or empires come to be in Mesopotamia? And it's because Mesopotamia was sort of an ideal place for turnover. Because it had so few natural barriers, it was very difficult to prevent people from invading. And because it was such a good place for agriculture, lots of people wanted to invade it so they could set up their civilizations there. So we get this pattern where a civilization comes to be, like the Sumerians. They get overrun by people from another culture or nomads. And then these people create these large, well-organized empires, which then eventually get conquered on their own after running things fairly peacefully for a little while. So the cycle that we see in Mesopotamia is an empire comes to be, where civilization comes to be. It starts to get weak. It gets overrun and taken over by a new group. That new group incorporates their way of doing things into the old people's way of doing things. We get some cultural diffusion happening, and then the cycle repeats itself. So the first people to talk about are the Akkadians, who are led by Sargon. This is a modern day depiction of Sargon, and here is a potential ancient depiction of Sargon. Sargon has an interesting story, almost like the story of Moses. He was cast adrift in the Euphrates River by his mother because he was of illegitimate birth. He was rescued, however, from death by drowning in the river by a gardener. And later on, somehow became a cupbearer, so a servant to the king of a city called Kish. And after a while, he slowly but surely became more important until eventually he became the ruler of Kish, and enhanced his status by claiming lots of things like rulers do. He claimed that he was a lover of the goddess Ishtar, for instance. So rulers always have to do something to make themselves sort of connected to the divine world. And rather than saying he was a priest, he said he was the lover of a god or a goddess. And that was how he sort of claimed some sort of divine authority. But ultimately, Sargon's story is one of creating the first empire. So in 3000 to 2000 BC, we have lots of wars going on between the city-states of Sumeria. And eventually, Sargon starts taking over some of those cities after they've been weakened by these wars, right? When two people fight, whoever wins is going to be a little bit weaker than he was at the start, and a new person that tries to fight that person is probably going to have an advantage. And that's exactly what Sargon did. As the Sumerian cities were falling apart because of their own warfare or struggles, he started taking them over and included them into his own control. Until eventually he conquered so many of them that he was eventually declared the king of both Sumer and Akkad, so the ruler of Sumeria and his own actual territory. And this leads to the creation of the very first empire. Remember, we said that empires are when a ruler takes over land that doesn't originally belong to his civilization. Well, here we have the leader of Akkad taking over the lands of Sumeria. So this would be the first empire in the world. And as we remember, empires are great for cultural diffusion because you have this mixing and blending of cultures. One interesting thing that Sargon did was that he really took advantage of the political infrastructure that was in place, and he didn't really overwrite their culture. He didn't try to impose new cultural ideas on them. But the thing that Sargon did was he ruled with an iron fist. He basically ran everything as this tough guy, strongman. When he took over a new city of Sumeria or somewhere else, he would humiliate the rulers that were there. He would tear down the city's walls so they couldn't defend themselves against him ever again. At the city of Ur, for instance, he put his daughter in an important position, made her the high priestess of the temple of the god Nana. Um, and he never basically let anybody else run things. He could have said, all right, you are able to run the city and just report to me if something happens. But that's not what Sargon did. He put men who were loyal to him in charge of these cities, but he never let them have real control. He controlled everything himself, despite the fact that he set up a vassal system. So Sargon became like the linchpin of this new empire. He was the one holding everything together personally, and that has some negatives and positives. And we'll talk about those in a bit. One of the positives was that he could enforce a lot of really good change and good improvements in his empire by demanding this and demanding that. So he created a regular messenger service, a new calendar, better tax collection. Because he increased the borders of this territory, that gave his empire access to new materials and raw materials. So Sargon's sort of iron fist, rule everything personally kind of system was very good in some ways, because it allowed him to really create the first empire. But it did have some flaws. But before we get into this, I just want to give you a sense of where we are. So you can see Sumer on that map here. You can see Sumer is right there. It's sort of the bottom right of the Mesopotamian world. But Akkad is a much bigger area, right? A little bit above there. And you can see he ends up controlling all of those places. So gives you a sense of just how big this empire is. Now, I keep mentioning these negatives. The problem is Sargon may have been tough enough to create an empire, but he was not good at delegating, not good at letting other people kind of run things. And as a result, when he died, the empire that he created did not last. It was too reliant on Sargon's direct control, meaning that all the people that he had humiliated before, they wanted to rebel against him. And the most likely people to take over from Sargon, his descendants, didn't really get a chance to establish their own kind of iron fist control. His sons were assassinated. His daughter, the one that was installed in the temple at Ur, she got kicked out of the temple. His grandson committed acts of sacrilege, as in defying religious rules, doing things that were against religious propriety or religious customs. And as a result, everybody thought that he was an evil dude. And so they thought that Sargon's line and the entire world of Akkad had been cursed by the gods. And then eventually his great-grandson was defeated in a series of revolts led by the Sumerians. And eventually the Akkadians and Akkad, the empire, fell apart. So Sargon did a really great thing because he created the first empire. But because he was so domineering and because he refused to allow anybody else to help him control it, when he died, it made it a lot more difficult for people to rule after he was gone. The next group we want to talk about are the Babylonians, led by this guy, Hammurabi, although I have a much more accurate, potentially, image of him later. Here's a map just to give you a sense of where Hammurabi's group would be, sort of in the dead center of the Mesopotamian world. And here's a more contemporary version of Hammurabi from modern day. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon, the city of Babylon, which you can see on the map here near Kish. So kind of where, close to where Akkad had started, where Sargon had started. He, like Akkad, eventually took over the Sumerian city-states and brought them into his own empire. So not creating the first empire like Sargon did, but following a similar pattern. And like Sargon, he both incorporated the old customs of the people that he brought in. So he adapted and adopted a lot of Sumerian culture, cultural diffusion. But he also ruled like Sargon. He was very strong control over things and did the kind of vassal system too. So a sort of repeat of what we were seeing before with Sargon. The thing that Hammurabi is famous for, though, is his improvements to the legal system, and specifically what was known as Hammurabi's Code. This was not a series of laws that Hammurabi created out of nowhere. He didn't make any new laws. Instead, what he famously did was take all of the existing laws that were shared between all of these different groups all over Mesopotamia that he was now in charge of. And he kind of took all of them, put them in one place, and then collected them, streamlined them, and tried to figure out what was the best of the laws. So everybody was doing things in slightly different ways. Hammurabi looked at all the versions of things and said, now we're all going to follow this one way, according to my best decision. And he tried to slim down and combine all of these laws in such a way so that he would create the first set of codified law codes, gathered, collected, and streamlined, so that everybody would be treated under the same rules, no matter where they were in his empire. Now, the end result of this was that he created a uniform set of about 300 laws that everybody could follow to help bring more unity to his empire. Because if everybody's following the same rules, everybody's going to be more unified than if every city has a different set of laws. He didn't just create this collection of the laws, though. He also had to spread them out so that everybody could see them. And so he purposefully would go around and install these engraved tablets, like man-sized tablets. We have pictures of them on these slides here. This is just the top of one of the tablets, but these things are bigger than a person overall. And on these, he would engrave the laws so that if you ever had a question about what was going on with the laws or whether something applied to you, you could always check the steles. All right. These laws famously have a reputation for being very harsh, and they famously have a reputation for being based on retaliation, a concept that we call the law of the claw, or the lex talionis in Latin. If you've ever heard the phrase an eye for an eye, that is lex talionis. That is the law of the claw based on Hammurabi's code. If somebody does something bad to you, you as a punishment get to do something bad to them. And a lot of people wonder, why were these laws so harsh? Was it because Hammurabi was sort of a cruel dude or just a mean guy? And the answer is no. They were cruel or harsh because Hammurabi was trying to stop people from doing crimes before they did them. If you think of it this way, you're more likely not to do a crime if the punishment is more harsh than it is more lenient. So, if you make a crime and say that that crime is punishable by death, and then in another area you have the same crime, but it's punishable by a fine, more people are probably going to commit the crime in the place where there's a less parable punishment. And Hammurabi was not interested in dealing with lots of crime stuff on a day-to-day basis. He didn't want to have to establish a big prison system or a justice system. He just basically wanted to say, let's make the laws super punishing, make it very clear, and then that way we're going to prevent people from doing crimes in the first place. But if they do, then we'll have a very easy way to manage these things without having to get involved in a long legal process. So the harshness was designed to help stop the problems from happening in the first place. And so, as a result, he created this very effective law system, which was interesting because it represented one of the earliest times where the government was claiming it had responsibility for what happens in society. Okay, before, government was a thing, but it really didn't necessarily have any sort of obligation to the people. But when you set up an effective law system like this, all of a sudden you're taking responsibility at the government level for what happens in the day-to-day lives of citizens. And that's an important step. For us, we consider that to be the norm in the modern era. But for the ancients, that was not necessarily the case. One other interesting thing, a sort of side effect of this system, this codified law system, is that it helped to further establish the boundaries between people, the social classes. You know that we talk about social classes being a mark of civilization. Well, when you look at these laws, you see that some laws apply to nobles in a certain way, some laws apply to free people in a certain way. Some laws apply to slaves in a certain way. And so it's interesting, again, to see that these social classes are not just things that happen accidentally, but which get sort of chopped up legally, officially, according to government documents. The two main parts of Hammurabi's code were civil law and criminal law. Criminal law deals with offenses that are committed against other people. That's why it's called criminal law. If you are a criminal, you are doing something bad to somebody else. So robbery, assault, murder, those kinds of things. Civil law is the other half of Hammurabi's code, and that deals with sort of private rights, private matters, and things that aren't about doing something mean to someone else. Things that need a legal basis, but which are not about a crime that has been committed against somebody. So business contracts, inheritance rules, taxes, marriage laws, things like that. Interestingly, the civil law codes have a lot of interesting laws that are designed to protect powerless people, slaves and women primarily. So some examples for women, women could pass on property to their children. That's something that doesn't happen necessarily in a lot of ancient cultures. Or wives that haven't committed any sort of crimes or done anything wrong can divorce their husbands. Again, something that doesn't necessarily occur in lots of other ancient societies. One interesting factor of the civil law codes in Hammurabi's code is that fathers seem to have almost complete control over their families, which is not unusual. This happens in a lot of ancient societies, but it is an interesting thing to see it actually set up that way in law. Criminal law, interestingly, had, like we said, these very harsh punishments. And it was designed, like we said, to prevent crimes from happening in the first place, but also to kind of stop vigilante justice from happening. Instead of, something bad happening to your family, and then you go off to do something terrible to another person's family, and this creates just a cycle of people doing horrible things to each other. You kind of help to encourage order in society by saying, look, we understand that this bad thing was done to you, this criminal offense, robbery, murder, such and such. We're going to handle the punishment. You get to just sit back and relax. And when we're done, the matter is settled and it's over with. And there's not going to be any further sort of down the line punishments. So an interesting thing, Batman style, vigilante justice is not supposed to be happening. And Hammurabi's code has tried to stop that from being the case. Here you can see the Hammurabi stele or stele that has the code on it. So on the back there, you can see the code inscribed here in cuneiform. Here you've got Hammurabi himself receiving some symbols of royalty from Shamash, the god of the sun. This is a nice little piece of propaganda to make Hammurabi look good, so that anybody who comes to read the laws also has to look and see, oh, look at how good Hammurabi is. The gods love him. So typical little piece of mixed propaganda and practical political use. I have a couple of excerpts from Hammurabi's code. We can take a look at these on your own, or you can go over them with me in class. And the code was not the only thing that Hammurabi did. He worked with his army to develop a very well-disciplined set of soldiers who had the latest technology, the latest tools to help him win and expand his empire. He worked on public works to keep the civilization going. Did some social reforms too. He definitely created an empire for himself to sort of rule over things from Babylon, but he let all the other Mesopotamian culture around him, from the Akkadians and the Sumerians, thrive. He didn't just shut them down. He famously promoted Babylonian gods, specifically the god Marduk, and he repaired temples. So he did a lot of stuff. I mean, Hammurabi is known for being a very effective ruler in a lot of different ways, but typically most people just remember him for his law code, and that's, important. So we should remember it's not the only thing he did.